Hello students, right from where we left off in the introduction, where I had told you that we will be beginning our study from the 18th century, and the reason was that that is where the foundation of modern architecture actually lies. Though authors often quote 20th century as the start of the modern movement, I will say it in this way that the modernist movement within the whole scheme of modern architecture began in the 20th century. That which has had the maximum impact on the architecture we see today. But the change really began all the way in the 18th century, and that came to be known as the age of the intellectual revolution. One revolution had already happened in the Renaissance, the time of Reformation, when great change came all across Europe, and Europe came out of the Dark Ages to a completely new era. There was a massive change, socio-cultural changes, scientific changes, changes in religion, and great scientists, reformers, artists like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo, all of them came up during this time. Now this change that began during the Renaissance period gathered further momentum in the 18th century. There was a vastly changing social structure, and the rule of the monarchs and the religious leaders, the grip they had on society, gradually started loosening, and there was the rise of pluralism, which has given way to our modern democracy. Pluralism basically means rule by a larger body of people. So it was not that it was similar to today's democracy, but the change towards democracy started happening at that time. There was also an anti-reaction against what was the Baroque period. Now you might have read in your history that after Renaissance, the changes that had come in the world of architecture gathered a further momentum in Baroque. In Baroque, architecture became profusely ornamental and decorative with intense use of color and sculpture, etc. And this style began to be questioned in the 18th century. There was a strong anti-reaction against this excessive use of ornamentation, paintings and color, and this was considered as corrupt in the 18th century. Therefore, there arose a completely new movement that came to be known as Neoclassicism, a Western movement in decorative arts and architecture that drew its inspiration from classical art and architecture of ancient Greece and Rome. Now, in the word Neoclassicism, Neo stands for new and classicism refers to the classical era. So you can say this is the rise of a new classical architecture in the 18th century, and this evolution is based on classical buildings like, for example, the Parthenon of Greece and the Pantheon of the Roman times, and these are the kind of buildings that came up during the neoclassical era. The one below is easily identifiable, it's the White House. Now what were the architectural types of neoclassicism? The buildings of ancient Greece and Rome, which were monumental, having very simple geometric forms, strict proportions, and they were unornamented. Whether you looked at the Colosseum or you looked at the Greek temple, this typology, these features were evident in them, and these were the ones that they tried to bring back in neoclassical era. So the principles for neoclassicism were derived from the architecture of the classical times. Vitruvian principles. Now what are Vitruvian principles? Vitruvian principles were given by Vitruvius in the Roman times, where he said that there are three important things, as you might still remember from the introduction slide that I had shown you, and that is form, function and structure. These three work in harmony with each other, then you get a good building. And you will find all across architectural times that these three are driving good architecture, the balance between form, function and structure. This as basic principle was given by Vitruvius, and then the third impact was that of 16th century Renaissance with the works of architect Andrea Palladio in the Renaissance period. Now neoclassicism itself was highly rational. It was reflecting a new age that was governed by reason. If you are doing something, there has to be a reason why you are doing it, and it grew and thrived all across Europe and then in America. Now you see a visible change from Baroque in this particular slide, where what I have done is I have taken two similar spaces and tried to correlate them or compare them. On your left is a Baroque period interior. On the right is Neoclassical. Definitely in the Neoclassical times there was ornamentation, but you find it is much more controlled, it is much less compared to what you find in the Baroque period, and it's quite visible in this picture. Now, one important event that happened during this time, rather an architectural event if I can call it that, was an imitation done of a house that was made in the Renaissance period called the Villa Rotunda. The Villa Rotunda was designed by Andrea Palladio, and this is the Villa Rotunda. In the 18th century, the Earl of Burlington, Richard Boyle, he designed a house called the Chiswick House in 1725, and this borrowed heavily, or in fact imitated, Villa Rotunda very strongly. So now the Villa Rotunda itself was a radical concept for the simple reason that what Andrea Palladio had done is he had taken sacred architecture, religious architecture, that of the Pantheon for example, and converted that into domestic architecture or a house, and this is the Villa Rotunda, the Villa Rotunda. The Villa Rotunda, and this is the Parthenon. So, this is the Roman Pantheon. So, he borrowed heavily from that, rather he converted a house and put the Roman temple in this, rather a house in the envelope of a Roman temple. So, this is what Richard Boyle had imitated, but it was not as strongly symmetrical as Villa Rotunda. If you look at Villa Rotunda's plan, it is perfectly symmetrical on all four sides. It is not so in the Chiswick house. Still, it was a strong, at least in the facade, it was a very strong imitation. Now, symmetry itself has been a perennial concept in architecture. You find symmetry in classical architecture, and you also find symmetry all the way back in Egyptian architecture, as you see here in the pyramid and the sphinx that you see in front of it. It is perfectly balanced in symmetry. Now, this symmetry has been carried forward, and we will see this a little later, that classical symmetry has played a very important role in modern architecture. For example, in the works of Mies van der Rohe, whether it is the Seagram building, and we will see more of it later, or the new National Gallery in Berlin, or the Crown Hall in the Illinois Institute of Technology in Chicago. Mies van der Rohe has borrowed this classical symmetry idea in his architecture in the modern times. Then there are other projects like that of IMPI, the glass pyramid, or the works of Calatrava, or the Baha'i temple by Firdous Sabah in Delhi, or this work. They may not be, they are not at all similar to classical temples and pantheons and colosseums, but they reflect the idea of classical symmetry. Now, right opposite to that, or contrast to that in the modern times, has been the free-flowing modernist house plans. Now, one thing I would like to state here, and that is that I will continue to connect the old with the new throughout my presentations, so that you are able to see that the ideas that I am talking about in the 18th century, how they get reflected in the 20th and the 21st century, or the ideas in the 19th, how they get reflected later, and also the contrast that came up. Like this is a contrast, free-flowing plans that came up with primarily initially with the works of Frank Lloyd Wright. We'll see that in the prairie houses later, and here is the example of the falling water, the classical organic plan or the free-flowing interior, and then we find that also in Villa Stein by Le Corbusier, and this house by Richard Meyer, the Smith House, all of them having a free-flowing plan versus the tremendous rigidity that you find in the plan of, say, the Chiswick House. Also, the interiors have changed dramatically. Now, if you go from Baroque, and we will go in the clockwise direction, this is Baroque leading on to the interiors of the neoclassical times, which are more restrained in ornamentation, versus, this is a little bit not exactly clockwise, we will come here, and this is the Baroque period, which had ornamentation based on natural forms, and we will discuss this later, to the modern times. This is the interior of Gropius's own house in America, very, very simplified interiors, straight lines and unornamented interiors. And contemporary interiors have carried on from the modernist times, like the Gropius house that I showed you, and they are also simple, unornamented, straight lines, or if they are curvilinear also, then also they are very simple, uncluttered appearance is what you get in the modern interiors. Now, Richard Boyle himself evolved as an architect, and he moved from imitation to interpretation. Now, this may seem to be a very simple building, this assembly halls at York that I am talking about in this slide, but it was in fact a very complicated exercise. In order to build this dancing halls at York, Richard Boyle, he thought of what should be the length of this hall, and he thought of the Christian basilica, that should be the length. In order to provide the colonnade inside, he thought of the Corinthian columns, and there are 48 Corinthian columns. In order to create the hall which is going to have these columns, as this is the plan of the dancing halls at York, or the assembly rooms at York, both names are mentioned for this. In order to create this Christian basilical length with Corinthian columns, he also thought or connected the idea to the Egyptian hypostyle hall. In order to provide light in the initial design, he thought of providing the Roman thermae windows as the clerestory windows. So, the assembly halls at York are there even today, and this is what the picture or the interior looks like. So, this was an interpretation. He thought of religious architecture or Egyptian architecture, or borrowed from Greek Corinthian columns, and merged these very diverse ideas together into a completely different building. This is the reason why I am teaching you about imitation interpretation, is that both ideas are applied by architects, and they can form a very good understanding of design for you. Like for example here, now this is the Villa Savoy made 1928 by Le Corbusier. This black Villa Savoy is designed in Australia, which is a direct and complete imitation of the Villa Savoy. On the other hand, this house, Villa du Ava, designed by Rem Koolhaas in Europe, is a house which borrows or interprets Villa Savoy but does not imitate it. So, there are features within it, and hopefully we will see Villa du Ava in more detail when we study about houses, that this interprets Villa Savoy, does not imitate it. So, again I will repeat that this can form or rather add to your understanding of architectural design. Imitation and interpretation are both used by architects. Now, interpretation in modern architecture is also there, so that you can actually see that this currently also it has an important role in design. For example, the Kohler house designed by Julie Snow in 2001, Snow Krilich architect, the main architect was Julie Snow. She designed this house in Canada. This house, if you look at it carefully, is hanging from a side of a cliff edge, or a mountain, hill edge, just like the cantilevered falling water. When the overall design in glass and steel, for example, with these kind of balconies, or the entire look of the house is so similar to the Farnsworth house, 1955, designed by Mies van der Rohe. So, this house is an interpretation of two different houses, or two different modern houses, the Falling Water and the Farnsworth house. Another house where I found a similarity or an interpretation is the Berman house in Australia by Harry Sidler in 1999. Again you find that he borrows, hanging on the edge of a cliff, cantilevering out, similar idea to the Falling Water, and the overall design has the appearance of the Farnsworth house. I will hopefully again talk about this a little more detail later, but the interior reflects both the houses together. It's very interesting, and I will show you the pictures where the interior is very comparable to that of the Farnsworth house. This picture, the one that you see here, we will talk about this house in detail later. This is the Roby house by Frank Lloyd Wright. So, this house, if you see this interior, it has got a living room space here, a fireplace, and the dining space behind it, and the Berman house has got exactly that feature. It has got a living space, a fireplace in between, and there is a space or other areas behind it. So, here he interprets the Falling Water and Farnsworth house, and the interesting part is that both these modern architects, Julie Snow and Harry Sidler, two similar examples, and they are interpreting that and building two different houses out of it. Now, please understand this, that this understanding you can multiply on your own, but you require an architectural vocabulary to be able to see a modern house and correlate it to something that was done earlier. Now, the impact of past in modern architecture, it's a myth that modern forms are not tainted, or rather are untainted by the past, or they do not have the past in them. It's wrong. Most profound architects of the modern times, or rather the past 80 to 100 years, have built architecture that is steeped in tradition. The only thing is that they have not done a superficial reuse, but they have given it a new meaning. They have not rejected history, they have inherited it and evolved it in a new way. Just as you find it here in the assembly building in Chandigarh, which is a very clear example of, you can directly correlate it to the Greek Parthenon, or whether it is the design of a tall building, the Shard, or the design of the new National Gallery in Berlin. Mies van der Rohe and the architects like Richard Rogers, Renzo Piano, Norman Foster, Le Corbusier, all of these architects have learned from history and reinterpreted it in a new way in the modern times. Coming back to neoclassical architecture, it moved forward and it appeared in buildings like the Kiddleston Hall, this is the Kiddleston Hall, or the Petit Trianon, which was in France. During this time, we find architectural theorists rising up and laying what became the fundamental principles of modern architecture. For example, Marc-Antoine Laugier said, the primitive hut is the purest form of architecture. It has got these, for example, this hut has got these trunks of trees, then it's got a trabeated and a pitched roof which is made out of branches. This, he said, this simple structure, simple trabeated form is the simplest or the purest form of architecture, and this implied that simple or simpler is better. So, you find simple structural systems evolving in the modern times also. You find, for example, the trabeated simple structure in the Greek system in stone. This is the primitive hut proposed by Laugier. Then you find the simple RCC domino system that was put together by Max Dubois, an engineer, and Le Corbusier. And then you have the moment frame, which is a simple gridiron frame that we find appearing in the tall buildings, and we will see that appearing first in Chicago in the 1880s and the 1890s. Now, the simple structural systems that came up over time with a lot of simplicity in them could be, for example, Bauhaus with the glass curtain wall and the RCC frame pushed inside, or the glass and steel moment frame of the Seagram building, or the cantilevers of the falling water, or even here when Le Corbusier took the domino system and converted that into the 5 points of a new architecture, and they appear in the Villa Savoy. Other theorists like Claude Perrault said that he appreciated both the Greek and the Gothic structural systems, and Carlo Lodoli said that architecture should derive entirely from the nature of its materials and the law of statics. Further, a growing understanding that materials should be more harmonious when we design our buildings, and that is what we see happening in the modern, what you would say, the 20th century, 21st century architecture. Structural systems that were there earlier times, for example, Gothic architecture, were not neglected. Like I said, the modern architects have borrowed or rather reinterpreted historical architecture. So, you find that the ribbed form within the Kudrochi Pavilion in Milwaukee Art Museum by Santiago Calatrava is so close to the ribbed forms inside a Gothic cathedral, or the flying buttresses that you find in Gothic cathedrals are similar to this building of Santiago Calatrava, giving a modern version in white painted steel, or the buttress appearing, for example, in this skyscraper, or here the same buttress appearing in a modern form here and here. So, we find the appearance of Gothic in modern architecture. Then when we think of Carlo Lauroli's idea about the nature of materials, how purely materials began to be used or how harmoniously they began to be used. For example, in the brutalist architecture of the assembly building in Chandigarh, where there is exposed RCC, exposed brick in Alvar Aalto's project, or in Tellison, Arizona project by Frank Lloyd Wright, he used local stone. And then there is the use of pure glass and steel in the Crown Hall by Mies van der Rohe. So these projects highlight how the nature of materials start playing an important role in the 20th, 21st century. Another thing that happened, and we will look at this again next slide next time when we look into the 19th century, when Jacques-Nicolas Louis Durand proposed that the ground plan is the great originator of the form, and this was the earliest iteration of the statement that came through Louis Sullivan, that form follows function. Now, there are 4 phases in Neoclassicism. There is the rationalist phase, the archaeological, the radical, and the visionary. When we come to the rationalist phase, the first phase, it is a shift towards rational, unornamented, I would say less ornamented buildings, a revival of classical architecture. We find, for example, in Jacques-Germain Soufflot's building, the Pantheon, designed in 1756 to 90 in Paris, which is combining the structural lightness of the Gothic churches with the purity of Greek architecture and putting it together in this one building. It has got unornamented surfaces, as you see on the outside. It has got load bearing columns, and that there are true structural members inside the building. Now, I also would like to compare the interior of Pantheon with Baroque architecture. Similar spaces are compared. This is Baroque. You can clearly see the amount of heavy ornamentation that is there in Baroque compared to the very controlled ornamentation in neoclassical times by Jacques-Germain Soufflot. Again, if you take this interior by Baroque and compare it to this one here, you still find that the ornamentation becomes much more controlled, and there is a major shift away from that. So, we will end here. When we are talking about these buildings, we will come back to the second stage. We will talk about the remaining 3 stages of neoclassical architecture in the next presentation. I will end this by saying that these ideas, which became the backbone of 20th century architecture, onwards into the 21st century, started germinating, taking root in the 18th century. Not only in the what theorists have said, but also in the architecture that was being produced at the time. When you look at the building, it does not automatically or directly, this building for example, or the Capitol building in America, do not look like the buildings of today. But principally, when we start searching behind them, we start realizing there are some principles that connect them or that form the basis of the architecture we see today. Thank you so much. We will go on to the next one when we talk of the other stages of neoclassical architecture. Thank you.